Should Fergie, the Duchess of York, be cancelled for calling notorious paedophile Jeffrey Epstein her supreme friend?
There is one detail about Sarah Ferguson that keeps coming up again and again whenever former palace staff speak. Not a major scandal, not a headline-grabbing moment, but something much smaller. Food. Or, more specifically, a picnic lunch that she would not give an answer for. It sounds trivial, but according to people who worked inside the royal household, it was anything but. And the reason this story is resurfacing now is not accidental. It comes at a moment when the Duchess of York is once again under scrutiny. With new allegations, she is planning to pawn off items in her Royal Lodge home. So today, I want to walk through what is actually being said, who is saying it, and why even a small story about a picnic lunch is being revisited now. Because when former royal staff speak, especially those who served multiple members of the family, they usually reveal more than they realise. Let's start with the man telling the story. Paul Burrell is not just any former palace employee. He worked inside the royal household for decades, first as a footman to Queen Elizabeth II, later serving the then Prince of Wales, and most famously as the butler and confidant of Princess Diana.
She's lost her charitable associations. We're going to be speaking to the York's biographer Andrew Lowney to find out what the king should do about his errant brother and sister-in-law.
Burrell says he worked closely with Diana from 1987 until her death in 1997. That gives him a unique vantage point, not just upstairs with the royals, but downstairs with the staff who made everything run. In his latest book, The Royal Insider, My Life with the Queen, the King and Princess Diana, Burrell draws a contrast between Diana and Sarah Ferguson, particularly in how they were received by staff. And one anecdote has stood out. He says during shooting weekends, when the men were out stalking, the women of the household would meet them later for a picnic lunch in the hills. This was not casual. Everything was planned in advance. A page would go around asking each guest what they wanted to eat. Lists were made, orders were placed. Nothing was left to chance. Except, on one occasion, Sarah Ferguson did not respond. Burrell claims that one member of staff became so frustrated by her failure to comply with the request that he lost his temper publicly. In Burrell's words, spoken loudly enough for everyone to hear, including the Queen, the staff member shouted, "What does that red-haired mare want for lunch?" According to Burrell, there was silence. No reprimand or reaction. It was as though the comment had never been made.
She has done a lot of good work for charity, particularly Teenage Cancer Trust, so it's sad to see those associations end. But the fact is, she is very greedy, she is very stupid, and she is very naive, and she's drawn into the ambit of these people, predators like...
That's quite telling, because it speaks volumes about how staff already felt. Burrell goes on to say that the opinion had already been formed downstairs based on gossip and behaviour, and moments like this only reinforced it. Now this story is being widely shared again, not because of the picnic itself, but because of what it suggests about Ferguson's relationship with palace staff, and how that relationship differed from Diana's. And this was not the only point of friction staff have spoken about over the years. Former palace employees have also previously claimed that Sarah would run them down with her requests. Often she would request extravagant meals, things like whole roast chickens or fully prepared spreads, only for much of it to go untouched. According to those accounts, large portions were often left behind and wasted, which quietly irritated staff whose job was to plan carefully and avoid excess.
Once best known as something of a Sloane Ranger, a posh party girl with a bubbly personality and bubbles in her glass. And no doubt that was what attracted Prince Andrew to her, popular with the public, if not with the entirety of the royal family.
Again, these are recollections rather than formal complaints, but taken together, they added to a growing sense downstairs that she could be unpredictable and, at times, dismissive of the effort being made around her. Burrell describes Diana as gentle, familiar, and deeply trusted by those who worked for her. By contrast, he says, Sarah was seen as younger, louder, and far more informal. He writes that she was 26 at the time, like what he called a bouncy, uncontrollable red setter puppy. Some upstairs may have found that refreshing. Downstairs, not so much. Burrell says that while Ferguson may have been a breath of fresh air for the family, the staff preferred the established Princess of Wales, someone they had known for years and felt comfortable around. In his telling, Ferguson was a newcomer who had to earn trust, and in his view, she did not always help herself. He also makes a point that palace staff could be snobbish. That cuts both ways. Now, under normal circumstances, this would be little more than an amusing footnote from palace life. But it is being revisited now for a reason. In recent days, Sarah Ferguson has been back in the headlines after images of her were released in the Epstein files, and an email was leaked whereby she refused to pay a staff member their wages owed. Andrew Lowney's biography, entitled, also includes details that place Sarah Ferguson very much inside the same difficult household environment staff were struggling with.
Was not well in the House of York, and when pictures emerged of her toes being sucked by her financial advisor and lover, whilst on holiday with her and Andrew's children, the end was in sight, just as much as those licked feet.
According to accounts he gathered from former aides, Sarah was not seen as a passive bystander to how the household functioned, but as someone who often reinforced a chaotic and demanding atmosphere. Staff described a home where boundaries were blurred, instructions could change suddenly, and expectations were inconsistent, which made day-to-day work stressful. Lowney reports that some aides felt Sarah could be warm one moment and dismissive the next, leaving staff unsure where they stood. Several described her as overly familiar when it suited her, but quick to assert rank when frustrated, which created tension among employees who relied on clear hierarchy to do their jobs properly. One former staff member told Lowney that working around Sarah required constant emotional adjustment because her moods and priorities were unpredictable, and that this was quietly exhausting over time. Going even further back into the history of Ferguson's time inside the royal family, some accounts of her earlier struggles to fit into formal palace life tie into how she was perceived by those around her. Former staff have said that while some saw her as warm and relatable, others found her too familiar and not inclined to embrace the strict customs and routines of royal household service, making it harder for her to build the kind of rapport that predecessors like Princess Diana enjoyed. Then there is another perspective from behind palace walls that have come out recently, which paint a picture of what life was like for those working around Sarah Ferguson and her ex-husband at Royal Lodge. One insider story that made headlines involves something as seemingly trivial as staff games and expectations.
So they're a compelling couple, these two, aren't they? And I've cited some of their history. The question now is what should happen? Fergie's been effectively cancelled. We've got a number of charities who have all disassociated themselves from her, said they no longer want her to be their patron.
According to palace sources reported in the press, Ferguson actually disapproved of a game Andrew used to play with staff, where he would hide a toy monkey around the house to test whether aides noticed it. The reporting noted that when Ferguson was present, the game was not allowed to take place, suggesting she drew clear lines about what she felt was appropriate behaviour from staff, even if she remained close with Andrew, despite his own controversial habits. So this story, it's not really about lunch. It is about how she was perceived by the people who worked closest to her, the ones who did not speak publicly at the time. And it is about how those perceptions are now being re-examined in light of new allegations. Interestingly, Burrell is careful not to portray Ferguson as malicious. He describes her as overly familiar, perhaps too casual, someone who struggled to adapt to the rigid structure of palace life. That is very different from outright cruelty. But palace life runs on hierarchy and routine, and when someone does not engage with that system, even in small ways, it can create resentment, especially among staff whose entire job is to anticipate needs and prevent disruption. Sarah Ferguson's representatives have refused to comment on Burrell's remarks. What's clear is that the past never really stays buried when it comes to the royal family. Stories resurface. Old dynamics are reassessed. Former staff speak when the timing feels right. And sometimes, a picnic lunch becomes a symbol for something much larger. So I want to ask you this. When former palace staff speak out years later, do you tend to believe their accounts? Or do you think hindsight and grievance play too big a role? What do you think Fergie is really like behind the scenes? Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you are not already subscribed, make sure you are, because there is plenty more royal news still unfolding.